It was a quiet morning, the sky still hazy with the remnants of dawn. A dog sat by the bus stop, its fur slightly matted and eyes unfocused, staring down the street as though waiting. Each day, it was the same. The world had forgotten, but the dog had not. Its paws, once eager to run, now lay still on the cold concrete, unmoving. A faint breeze carried the smell of distant rain, but the dog barely seemed to notice. A woman had promised to return. She hadn't. Hours passed and the bus came and went, yet the dog remained. Cars hummed past, oblivious to the canine sentinel who never moved. And still, the dog waited. For what? It wasn't clear. There was no one to ask, no one to tell the dog that waiting was futile. The world had grown numb to its presence. It was as if the dog were a ghost, tethered only by memories and the fading scent of someone it once knew. The sun climbed higher, but the dog remained, waiting. Always waiting. The morning turned to noon, and still, the dog remained. No sign of the woman. No sign of anyone, really. The world continued, indifferent to the dog's vigil. People passed by, wrapped in their own lives, unaware of the creature that had become a fixture in the street. The dog had seen it all. The rush of morning commuters, the chatter of children on their way to school, the hum of city traffic. But none of it mattered. Not to the dog. It had made its promise, and the world around it seemed to fold into a blur. The scent of rain lingered in the air, but it didn't matter. Time was only marked by the passing of vehicles, the shifting light, and the fleeting shadows of the people who walked by. A new day had started, but for the dog, it was always the same. The clock ticked, but the dog's world remained still. It was a moment frozen in time, lost in the gap between the past and the uncertain future. Waiting, always waiting. By the time afternoon rolled around, the dog had almost become part of the landscape, like an old lamppost or a forgotten bench. The sun now hung higher, casting harsh shadows that contrasted sharply with the dog's soft, faded fur. The street had filled with people, and yet the dog's spot remained vacant of human presence, save for the occasional glance or brief stare from a passerby. It didn't mind. The dog was used to being overlooked, a silent figure against the backdrop of life rushing by. Time had lost its meaning. The bus never stopped, and the woman never came. How many days had it been? The dog couldn't count. The world had long stopped asking questions about its presence. But there was one thing that remained certain: the dog was not leaving. Its body ached, and hunger gnawed at its insides, but it didn't move. It would wait, because that's what it knew to do. And if the world forgot, so be it. The dog would wait. As the afternoon began to fade, a small shift occurred. The dog's ears twitched. A car slowed down near the bus stop, its engine purring as it rolled to a stop at the curb. For a fleeting moment, the dog's eyes flickered with life, an instinctual hope stirring within its chest. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. The car's window rolled down, revealing an older man who looked at the dog with a mixture of curiosity and pity. He watched the dog for a moment, his gaze lingering as if deciding whether or not to approach. But before he could make up his mind, the car sped away, and with it, the briefest glimmer of possibility disappeared. The dog's head tilted slightly, as though processing the brief interaction, but soon its eyes returned to the empty street. Nothing had changed. It would wait. Always waiting. As dusk crept in, the city's noise began to soften. The dog's vigil had lasted all day, and it seemed the night would pass just as the day had. Alone, waiting. The last few commuters trickled by, their hurried steps fading into the night, leaving only the sound of distant traffic. The dog's head drooped, its eyes growing heavy, though it did not fall asleep. The weariness of waiting was evident in the slow, deliberate movements of its body, the silent resignation in the droop of its shoulders. Yet, even as the darkness of night wrapped the street in its cool embrace, the dog remained. The promise was still alive, buried deep within the dog's heart, no matter how empty the street became. It was quiet now. The lights from the street lamps cast an orange glow over the dog, marking the passing of yet another day. Still, it waited. Always waiting. The dog had been a constant presence at the bus stop for weeks, but before that, it had lived a different life, one full of love and warmth. Its coat was once glossy, its eyes bright with joy. There were people who smiled at it, fed it treats, and called it by name. The dog had a family then. They took it on walks, threw balls for it to chase, and promised that they'd always be together. But those promises were broken, and the dog was left behind. It didn't understand why. The bus stop became its world, its refuge. It still remembered the warmth of its former home, the way the sun felt as it played in the backyard. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the memories began to fade, replaced by the harshness of the street and the cold loneliness of waiting. The dog's fur was no longer shiny. It had grown thin, and its steps had slowed. But somewhere, deep inside, there remained the faintest hope that the warmth would return. That someday, someone would come back. The sound of a distant siren broke the stillness of the afternoon, pulling the dog's attention for the briefest moment. It perked up, eyes focused, but soon the siren faded into the background. The dog let out a soft sigh and resumed its wait. It had learned not to expect too much anymore. People passed by without acknowledging its presence, their footsteps echoing off the pavement as they continued on their way. The dog remained rooted to the spot, its posture weary but unwavering. It was a silent sentinel, watching the world move around it. The occasional bus passed, but it didn't stop. The dog's eyes, once full of life, now only reflected the fading light of the setting sun. It wasn't hungry, not really, but the emptiness inside it seemed to grow. What would it take for the world to notice? The dog longed for a single hand to reach out, to offer a kind word or a simple touch. But all it got was silence. The world had moved on, but the dog stayed, waiting for someone to return. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the air grew cooler. The dog's coat seemed thinner now, a patch of bare skin showing through its fur. The once luxurious hair that had gleamed in the sunlight was now dull, matted from the many days spent on the street. The small hopeful spark in its eyes flickered briefly as another car approached. But it wasn't the person the dog was waiting for. It wasn't even a familiar face. The car sped by, and once again, the dog was left with only the sound of the engine fading into the distance. There had been so many like that, so many fleeting moments where the dog thought someone might stop, might recognize it, might offer a small piece of the love it once knew. But each time, the car passed, and the dog was left behind. This was its life now. A blur of motion, of faces that didn't look down, of opportunities that vanished in the blink of an eye. Still, the dog waited. Another day passed. The dog had been sitting at the same bus stop for so long that it began to wonder if it had become part of the scenery. Passers-by didn't even notice it anymore. A couple of children threw a few glances its way, but they never stopped. They never asked why it was there or what it was waiting for. There was no one to ask those questions. The dog had become invisible, like the streetlights that flickered to life at dusk, or the cracked pavement that no one bothered to fix. But despite this, the dog's loyalty never wavered. Its purpose remained clear: to wait. It wasn't sure for what or for whom, but there was a pull inside its chest, a belief that somehow, if it stayed long enough, everything would be as it was before. And so, with the setting sun casting long shadows across the concrete, the dog waited, eyes fixed on the horizon, heart set on the past that still lingered like a distant memory. Night fell, and the street became quiet. The bus stop, once filled with the sound of passing cars and distant chatter, was now silent. Only the rustling of the leaves in the wind broke the stillness. The dog had been here for what felt like an eternity, and yet it didn't move. It was no longer waiting for a bus. It was waiting for something deeper, something intangible that kept it tethered to this spot. A promise. A memory. The dog's body had grown frail, its movements sluggish, but its resolve was unshaken. As the last few lights in the city flickered and died, the dog remained. The world around it had long since fallen asleep, but the dog's vigil continued. Through the night, into the early hours of morning, and back again. Waiting. Always waiting. The sun began to set again, casting an orange hue across the city. The dog remained at its post, still waiting, but today, something felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, as though the city had grown tired of the dog's presence. People hurried past, their eyes not once lingering on the lonely creature. A few dropped crumbs from their takeout meals, but none stopped to offer the dog a kind word or a hand. The cruelty was subtle, but it cut deeply. The bus stop, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. The dog's body was thinner now, its coat patchy and rough from the harsh elements. Its bones ached with each passing day, but still, it didn't move. It had learned that movement brought nothing but disappointment. The few times it tried to approach someone, it was ignored, sometimes even shooed away. It had been abandoned, not just physically, but emotionally. And that was a cruelty that lingered long after the physical wounds had healed. The dog wasn't just waiting anymore. It was enduring. A group of teenagers walked by the bus stop, laughing and joking, their voices echoing off the concrete. The dog watched them, a flicker of curiosity in its eyes. One of the teens noticed the dog, and without a second thought, he kicked a stray bottle towards it, making it roll right up to the dog's feet. The others snickered, watching with amusement as the dog, startled, jumped back slightly. But the dog didn't growl, didn't bark in retaliation. It simply stood there, confused and hurt. The group continued on, their laughter fading as they disappeared into the night. The dog stood still for a moment, the bottle at its feet. No one cared. No one cared about the hurt that lingered in the dog's chest. It had been abandoned and mistreated, and yet it still waited. There was a faint sting in the dog's heart, a reminder of what it had lost. But it stayed. It always stayed. As the days passed, the dog grew weaker. The harsh treatment from the world continued, each day blending into the next, but the cruelty came in different forms. A child threw a rock at the dog once, laughing with friends, and the dog merely moved aside, its tail drooping. It had learned not to fight back. The physical pain was easier to bear than the emotional wounds, and the dog had learned to keep its distance. No one cared about the creature that sat at the bus stop day after day. People avoided eye contact, hurried past, pretending it wasn't there. The dog's body was becoming frail, but it didn't move. The more the world pushed it away, the more it stayed, a sad testament to its loyalty and to its unbroken will to wait. But deep down, the dog knew that time had worn it down, and it was just a matter of time before even the last thread of hope unraveled. One night, the dog was startled by a loud noise, a car screeching to a halt just a few feet away. It jumped, its heart racing in fear, but when it looked up, the car was empty. It hadn't even stopped for the dog. The streetlights flickered, casting uneven shadows across the scene. For a moment, the dog's eyes darted around, as if expecting something to change. But nothing did. The world continued, as if the dog didn't exist. A flash of anger stirred within the dog's chest, not at the car, but at the injustice of it all. It had been abandoned, ignored, and mistreated for so long that even the simplest form of attention was now alien to it. The dog was trapped in a cycle of abuse, both physical and emotional. And yet it waited, hoping that the next car would stop, hoping that the next person would notice it. But it was always the same: silence, cruelty, and emptiness. As the night wore on, the dog grew more and more exhausted, its eyelids heavy. Yet, it still didn't leave. It had been abandoned for so long that it didn't remember what it was like to be loved. All it knew was waiting. The world had stopped offering kindness. The dog's days of running in the park chasing after a ball had long passed. Now, it was just a figure in the shadows, a forgotten presence waiting for something that might never come. The emotional pain was a constant, and the physical one was slowly catching up. But still, the dog stayed, as though driven by a single unshakable belief: that maybe, just maybe, if it waited long enough, someone would come. But as the hours stretched on, the chances grew slimmer. The cruelty of abandonment was no longer a shock, it was a routine. And the dog had learned to endure it. The dog's weight was unbroken, its existence a fixture in the quiet rhythm of the street. Yet, even as it sat motionless, life continued around it. People walked by, some with heads down, others in conversation, lost in their own worlds. Among them was a woman in her late 30s, bundled in a coat that seemed a little too large for her small frame. She often passed by the dog, her eyes never meeting its. She noticed the dog, she saw it every day, standing at the bus stop, waiting. But she never stopped. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the weight of her own pain, or maybe it was just easier to pretend she didn't see the dog at all. She had once been a dog owner herself, but after her husband passed away, she couldn't bear the thought of having another. The emptiness in her own life was reflected in the dog's, a silent reminder of all the things left behind. Yet, something inside her stirred each time she walked past. She couldn't help but feel the pull of its silent gaze, and yet she kept walking. Days turned into weeks, and the woman's daily ritual continued. She walked past the dog without ever acknowledging its presence, her mind always preoccupied. Yet, the dog remained. One day as the dog sat motionless, the woman stopped. She glanced at the dog, her eyes lingering for a moment, but this time she didn't immediately turn away. Something in her shifted. She bent down, hesitating for a moment, and with a soft sigh she reached out her hand. The dog didn't move. It had been so long since anyone had reached out to it, and it was unsure if it should even respond. But then with a quiet whimper, the dog nudged the woman's hand, its fur rough under her touch. For a moment, the world felt smaller, quieter, as if both the woman and the dog had stopped, just for a second, to feel something other than loneliness. But just as quickly, the moment passed, and the woman stood up, withdrawing her hand. She gave the dog one last look, then continued her walk, her heart heavy but her mind unclear. Over the next few days, something changed in the woman. She couldn't stop thinking about the dog, its sad empty eyes, and the way it waited, unmoving, day after day. She had her own pain to carry, and it was easier to ignore the dog than confront her own fears and regrets. But now, every time she passed, her gaze lingered on the dog. She found herself wondering what it had been through, why it had been abandoned, and how long it had been waiting. She began to notice the cracks in the dog's fur, the way its ribs showed through its thin coat, the silent desperation in its eyes. She knew she couldn't just keep walking. But the thought of taking the dog in, of caring for something again, made her hesitate. She had closed herself off so completely, and the idea of opening up to another animal, of risking that attachment once more, was terrifying. What if she couldn't love it the way it deserved? What if she failed it, just like she had failed the ones she had loved before? Then one morning, as the woman passed by, something shifted. She noticed the dog struggling to get up. It wobbled on its legs, its body weak and frail. It made it only a few steps before it collapsed back onto the cold concrete, too tired to continue. Her heart clenched in her chest. For the first time, the woman couldn't turn away. She knelt down beside the dog, her breath shallow, unsure of what to do. The dog looked up at her, its eyes clouded with exhaustion, but still, it waited. It had waited for so long, and now it was waiting for something else, for someone to take the first step. She gently reached for the dog, carefully lifting it into her arms. It didn't resist, too weak to fight back. As she held it close, she felt the weight of its bones, the frailty of its body. The dog wasn't just a stray, it was a survivor. And in that moment, the woman realized that maybe, just maybe, she could be a part of its survival. The woman carefully carried the dog to her home, a small quiet apartment in the city. She settled it on a warm blanket by the window, watching as it lay down, its tired eyes closing for the first time in what felt like forever. The woman sat beside it, her fingers lightly brushing its fur, a quiet promise forming in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, But she knew that this moment, this act of kindness, was the first step in a new beginning for both of them. The dog, once abandoned, had found a new chance. And the woman too had found something she thought she had lost. A sense of connection, a spark of life she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a grand gesture, and there were no promises that things would be perfect. But for the first time in a long while, the woman felt a sense of hope. The dog had been in the woman's care for a week now. Its body had begun to fill out a little, its fur slowly becoming softer and more manageable. There were still scars, both physical and emotional, but the dog was healing. Every day, it seemed to grow more comfortable in its new surroundings. And the woman, too, was beginning to feel a change. The emptiness that had plagued her for so long was slowly being filled with the dog's quiet companionship. Yet, despite the newness of their bond, there was still something unspoken between them, something that neither of them could yet address. The woman had been reluctant to visit the vet, unsure of what the dog's past might reveal. But today, something pushed her to do it. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that she needed to know more about the dog's history, about what had happened before it arrived at the bus stop. She didn't realize it yet, but this visit would uncover something that would change everything. At the vet's office, the woman sat in the waiting room, her fingers nervously tapping on the armrest. She had spent so much time focused on the dog's well-being that she hadn't stopped to consider the past. What had happened to it before? Why had it been abandoned at the bus stop, left to wait for a family that would never return? The vet called her name, and she followed, the weight of her decision heavy in her chest. The dog was placed on the examination table, its body stiff with apprehension, but it didn't resist. The woman stood nearby, watching, anxious to hear what the vet would say. After a brief examination, the vet turned to her, his face grave. "This dog was once trained," he said. The woman's heart skipped a beat. "Trained?" she asked. The vet nodded. "This is a service dog, or at least it was at one time." The revelation struck the woman like a cold wave. The dog's past was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The woman's mind raced as she left the vet's office. The dog, a trained service animal? It didn't make sense. She couldn't reconcile the dog's current state, frail, abandoned, and broken, with the idea that it had once been a highly trained and trusted companion. The vet had explained that many service dogs were retired or rehomed after their owners no longer needed them, but the fact that this dog had been left to wait, to fend for itself, was a betrayal on an entirely different level. The woman wondered, who had abandoned it? Had it been left in the street? Was it dumped at the bus stop intentionally? She felt a deep pang of injustice for the dog. She had thought she was offering it a fresh start, but in truth, the dog's story had been shattered long before it found its way to her. And yet, despite the revelations, the woman couldn't turn away. The dog was still here. It had survived, and somehow, it was still waiting. And now, so was she. That night, as the woman sat in her small living room, the dog curled up at her feet, she couldn't stop thinking about the past. It was clear that the dog had once been loved, but who had loved it, and why had they abandoned it? She could feel the weight of the dog's history pressing on her, and with it, the responsibility of her role in its new life. But as she stroked the dog's head gently, she realized something. The dog's past didn't define it. It was no longer the service dog it once was, nor the abandoned creature waiting by the bus stop. It was hers now. And in that moment she made a vow. She would help the dog heal, just as it had helped her heal. The dog wasn't just a survivor. It was a new beginning, and together they would face whatever came next. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right path. The next day, the woman took the dog for a walk, her steps more confident, the dog by her side. They moved through the streets together, the dog's once weak steps now more steady, though still cautious. As they walked, the woman felt a new connection growing between them. A bond forged not just from care, but from shared experiences. The dog's past, its training, its pain, were all part of who it was. But it didn't define the dog anymore, and it didn't define her either. They were both survivors, in their own way. And together, they would continue to heal. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a life they were building together. As the dog walked beside her, tail wagging slightly, the woman realized that they were no longer waiting. They had both found what they needed in each other, and that was enough. Days passed, and the bond between the woman and the dog grew stronger. Yet, despite their closeness, something lingered in the woman's mind. The dog, once a service animal, had been abandoned. She couldn't ignore its need for purpose. She decided to take it to a rehabilitation center, a place where it could be trained again, not to return to its former role, but to find a new one. It was a big step, and the dog was unsure, but the woman knew it was the only way forward. "We can do this," she whispered to the dog, her voice full of resolve. At the rehabilitation center, the dog was placed in a small room, its eyes filled with apprehension. The woman stood by, unsure of the future, but feeling a growing sense of hope. The vet approached. "This dog was once a service dog," he said. "It can find a new purpose." The woman's heart raced. The dog's past was far more complicated than she realized. But this was a new chapter, one filled with possibilities. "We'll help him find himself again," the vet assured her. The dog looked up at the woman, a silent plea in its eyes. She nodded. The following weeks were full of challenges. The dog struggled with some of the tasks, hesitant to push itself. The woman visited every day, watching as the dog slowly regained strength. But the process wasn't just about physical healing. It was about trust. "We'll get through this," the woman whispered each time the dog faltered. And little by little, the dog began to trust again. Its body grew stronger, and with each new challenge, a glimmer of its old self began to return. The woman smiled, seeing the dog's tail wag for the first time in weeks. One day, the dog performed a difficult task perfectly. It obeyed the command without hesitation, moving with newfound confidence. The woman stood at the side, her eyes welling with tears. "You did it," she whispered. The trainers clapped, and the dog's tail wagged, its body relaxed for the first time. It wasn't just the physical training that mattered. The dog had found its strength, its confidence. The woman knew then that this was the turning point. They had crossed the threshold. The dog wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. As the training progressed, the dog grew more confident, no longer the fragile creature it once was. The woman walked with it on the final day of training, both of them moving forward with a sense of purpose. "You've come so far," the woman said softly. The dog walked beside her, its tail wagging gently. It wasn't just the dog that had changed, she had too. Together, they had found healing. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together. The woman and Max had found a new routine. Every morning, they walked together through the quiet streets. Max's confidence had returned, and his once worn body now moved with strength. The woman smiled as she watched him. "We've made it," she whispered. "No more waiting." They had both found healing in each other, and Max was no longer the dog left behind. He had a future now, with her. One afternoon, an older man approached them in the park. "That's a beautiful dog," he said, smiling at Max. "He looks like he's been through a lot." The woman nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "He has, but he's come a long way." The man smiled warmly. "You've done well by him." The woman felt a rush of gratitude, realizing just how far they had come. Max had transformed. No longer the frail dog of the past, he was now energetic and playful. The woman marveled at the change. "Look at you," she said, tossing a ball for him. "You're a whole new dog." Max chased after it eagerly, tail wagging. For the first time in a long while, they both felt light. The woman had learned to trust again, just as Max had. The seasons changed, but their bond only grew stronger. Together, they had created new routines, quiet mornings, peaceful evenings. Max no longer needed training. He had found his place, and so had she. "I never thought we'd make it here," the woman said one evening, stroking Max's head. But here we are. She smiled down at him, grateful for the love they had found in each other. As they sat together on the same park bench where they had met months ago, the woman looked down at Max, his head resting on her lap. "You never gave up?" she whispered. Max's tail wagged gently. They had both endured, and now they had found peace. No more waiting. They had found their home in each other.